Eleanor Ashworth stood in the corridor outside her husband's study with a cup of chocolate going cold in her hands, and she did not drop it. She did not raise her voice. She did not ask him to repeat himself. Though the door was only half shut, and his words had come through it clean and entire, the way bad news always does. She set the cup down on the hall table, both hands steady, and closed her fingers around the small brass key that hung at her throat on a faded ribbon, the one thing in that house that had ever been given to her, and not merely assigned to her, and she held it until the metal warmed. By the time the leaves turned again, she thought, the county would know precisely what a duke's wife was worth, and it would not be the sum he had just named. The autumn of 1816 had come to Hampshire the way it always did, indifferent to what it interrupted, laying gold over the beechwoods and frost over the low pastures, as though nothing in any house needed tending but the harvest. At Rowan Hall the harvest had been tended. So had the accounts, the roof of the east wing, the tenant cottages along the river bottom, and the ledger of wages that no one but Eleanor had opened in 11 months. She had married Julian Ashworth, Duke of Rowan, 3 years before, in a match arranged by his father and her father's old friendship, and she had gone into it clear-eyed, expecting a working arrangement rather than a love match, and had built one. What she had not expected was how completely a house could run on a woman's labour while crediting none of it to her name. She rose before the servants some mornings, not because anyone required it of her, but because the estate's books did not balance themselves, and Julian had never once asked to see them. He had inherited the title 14 months earlier. When old Duke Edmund died in his sleep in November, and grief had made him more remote, not less, a man who worked through his father's papers with his jaw set and his sentences shortened, who thanked her for the household's smooth running the way a man thanks an efficient clock. She had learned the particular silence of a man who mistakes composure for coldness and calls both duty. She had learnt to read him in the set of his shoulders rather than his words, because his words, when they came, were rationed like everything else about him. Tonight was the county assembly marking the end of the mourning year, the first grand evening Rowan Hall had hosted since Edmund's death, and Eleanor had spent 6 weeks preparing it the way she prepared everything, with lists, with numbers, with her own 2 hands checking what the housekeepers did not have time to check twice. She had chosen the wine. She had settled the dispute between the fishmonger and the cook. She had, that very afternoon, walked the drainage ditch along the lower meadow with the land steward to be certain the ground would hold 200 carriages without swallowing a single wheel. She had done all of this so that her husband could stand in his father's hall and be admired, and she had expected nothing from it beyond the ordinary satisfaction of work well done. She had not expected Lady Cassandra Vane on his arm at the receiving line, laughing at something only the 2 of them seemed to find amusing, her hand resting on his sleeve with the ease of long habit. She had not expected the murmur that moved through the arriving guests, like water finding a familiar channel. And she had certainly not expected, 20 minutes later, to pass the half-open door of Julian's study and hear her own name spoken in his flattened, arithmetic voice, the voice he used for accounts and instructions and nothing that mattered to him. Eleanor is suitable, he was saying to his aunt, or to the heir, or to whoever stood near enough to receive the verdict. She keeps the house as it should be kept. That is all I require of a wife. I am not obliged to love her for it. There was a pause, and in it, Eleanor heard Cassandra's low laugh, soft as poured cream, agreeing with him before he had even finished agreeing with himself. That was the whole of it. 3 sentences, delivered in the tone he might have used to describe a well-oiled hinge. She stood very still in the corridor, and the cup went down on the hall table, with both hands steady, and she found, when she searched herself for the expected wound, that what she felt was not surprise. It was confirmation. She had suspected the shape of his private accounting of her for months. Now she had the figures. She did not go in. She did not weep in the corridor, where a footman might round the corner and find her. She allowed herself 4 minutes. She had learned, over 3 years, to count them, the way she counted everything else, and to file whatever was left over into a drawer of herself she did not open during working hours. And at the end of the 4th minute she smoothed her skirts, checked her reflection in the darkened window glass, and walked into the ballroom to greet her guests, as though she had heard nothing at all worth repeating. It was, she would think later, the last night she ever allowed herself to be surprised by what a man who did not know her called her worth. She had learned young that a household run well is invisible, and a household run badly is the only kind anyone notices. Her own father, Thomas Hale, had managed land for 3 different families before his death, and had told her more than once, over ledgers spread on the kitchen table by candlelight, that numbers do not lie, though people believe endlessly that they can make them. She had kept that with her the way other women kept scripture. She kept it with her now, moving through the ballroom in blue silk, accepting compliments on the wine and the flowers and the arrangement of the tables, while behind her, at the edge of her vision, Julian stood beside Lady Vane, and did not look for his wife once. She found Mrs. Fenwick, the housekeeper, near the supper-room, refilling a tray with the brisk economy of a woman who had run this house through 2 dukes and had no patience left for a third's foolishness. Mrs. Fenwick took one look at her and set the tray down. "You've heard something, Mrs., Fenwick said. It was not a question. "I've heard exactly what he thinks of me," Eleanor said plainly for once. "I ought to be grateful for the honesty. Are you?" "No." Eleanor straightened a fork that did not need straightening. "But I intend to use it." Mrs. Fenwick studied her for a long moment, the way she might have studied a column of figures that refused to sum correctly on the first pass. "Then you'll want the estate books moved to the east study," she said finally. "The light's better in the mornings, and nobody thinks to look for you there." It was not comfort. It was information, offered the way this house's oldest servant offered everything that mattered, sideways, practical, and exactly on time. Eleanor almost smiled. "Thank you, Mrs. Fenwick, don't thank me. Do the work." The housekeeper picked the tray back up. "That's always been the whole of what you're good at, in this house. Might as well be good at it on purpose now." Eleanor went to bed that night beside a husband who did not know she had heard him, and she did not sleep, and she did not weep either. She lay with her eyes open, and made a list in her head, the way she made every list, in order of what could be done first. In the morning she rose before the servants, as she always did, and she did not go to the breakfast-room. She went to the east study, where the light was better, and she opened the estate ledgers, and she began, in earnest, to build something a man's careless arithmetic could not erase. The Lower Meadows drainage had been failing for 3 years before anyone thought to ask Eleanor about it, largely because no one had thought to ask Eleanor about anything beyond menus and linen. The tenant families along the river bottom lost a portion of their barley to standing water most autumns, and old Duke Edmund's steward had proposed, twice, a new culvert at a cost the estate could not spare, while the war years still hung over its finances. Julian, absorbed in his father's unfinished correspondence and his own grief, had let the proposal sit unread in a drawer for 11 months. Eleanor read it in an afternoon. She read it twice more the next day, walked the ground herself in boots borrowed from a groom, and found what the previous steward's report had not quite said outright, that the culvert he wanted was 3 times larger than the water required, and 3 times more expensive than necessary, because he had costed it against a flood that came once a decade and not the ordinary autumn rise that came every year. She redrew the plan herself, with her father's old habits guiding her pencil, and brought it to Absalom Reed, the estate's land steward, a broad, sun-browned man who had worked Rowan land for 20 years and trusted duchesses roughly as far as he trusted weather forecasts. "Begging your pardon, your grace," he said, turning her drawing over as though it might improve upside down. "But this isn't the sort of thing a lady generally troubles herself with." "No," Eleanor agreed. "It's generally the sort of thing that troubles the tenants instead, every October, when their barley rots in standing water. I'd rather trouble myself with it than them." She tapped the drawing. "Your channel is sound. Your outlet is not. Move it 40 yards downstream, past the willow root system, and you won't need a culvert at all. You'll need a ditch a quarter the price, dug before the first frost." Reed looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he looked at her. 40 yards, he said slowly. "That saved near £200 against my old figure." 211, Eleanor said. "I costed the labour at harvest rates, not spring rates, since that's when you'll need the hands free." He did not smile. He was not a smiling man. But something in his face loosened. The particular unclenching of a man who has spent years being right about land and has just met someone else who might also be right about it. "I'll have it dug within the fortnight," he said, "if your grace will authorise the expense." "I will," Eleanor said. "Send the bill to me, not to his grace. He has enough correspondence." That was not entirely true. It was, more precisely, that she did not wish to explain to Julian why she had spent an afternoon in a groom's boots redesigning a drainage channel he had never read the report on. But the ditch was dug within the fortnight, and it held through the first hard rain of November, and word of it moved through the tenant cottages the way water moves downhill, finding every low place, filling it, and running on to the next. It was Mrs. Fenwick who mentioned it to Julian in passing, over some unrelated household matter that the Reed family and the Carters and the Whitlocks along the bottom had been saying the Duchess had saved their barley crop with 40 yards of ditch and a sum £200 under the old estimate. Julian said nothing at the time. But that evening, at dinner, he looked at his wife for a moment longer than the ordinary courtesies required, and asked, in the flattened voice he used for things that were not accounts, whether it was true. "It's true," Eleanor said, and offered nothing further, because he had not asked her 3 years ago, and she saw no reason to reward the asking with more than the fact required. He did not smile. But he did not look away either. And that, for a man who had spent a decade training himself not to look at anything too closely, amounted to something. There was, underneath the drainage business, a smaller matter Eleanor filed away without remark. A letter had come for Julian from his cousin, Reginald Price, a man Eleanor had met perhaps 4 times in 3 years, and liked less with each meeting. Something about an old debt of the late Duke's, a note Reginald claimed to hold, dated some years back, secured against Hartwell Grange. Julian had read it, frowned, and set it aside as the sort of tangled family business that could wait until spring. Eleanor, passing his desk to leave the drainage figures for his signature, saw the amount named at the bottom of the letter, £15,000, with interest compounding since 1808. And something in her, the same instinct that read 3 times inflated culvert estimates correctly on the first pass, did not believe it. She said nothing. She only remembered it, the way she remembered every number that did not sum correctly, and set it in the same drawer where she kept everything that was not yet ready to be used. The wool crisis came in January, and it was worse than the drainage, because it touched money the estate did not have to spare, and a man Eleanor did not yet fully understand. The Rowan flocks had always gone to the same broker in the county town, an arrangement old Duke Edmund had made decades before, and never revisited, and that January the broker's price came in 11% below the previous year's, on the flimsy claim that the market had softened. Eleanor did not believe that claim any more than she had believed Reginald Price's compounding interest, and she spent 4 days writing to 3 other brokers in 2 counties, comparing prices, freight costs and terms, before she brought the comparison to Julian's study herself, unbidden, and set it on his desk. "You've undercosted your own wool for 6 years," she said without preamble, because preambles wasted time neither of them had. "Hartley pays 11% more and covers the carriage himself. I've drafted the letter. It wants only your signature." Julian read it in silence, the particular silence of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes, because it proves him wrong about something he had never troubled to check. "My father used Ferris for 30 years, he said finally. "Your father used Ferris because Ferris's father sold to your grandfather," Eleanor said. "Loyalty is not the same as good sense, Your Grace. You may keep both if you like, but you needn't pay 11% for the privilege." He looked at her the way he had looked at her over the drainage, a beat too long, weighing something he was not accustomed to weighing in a wife. "You've done all this yourself," he said. It was not quite a question. "Someone has to," Eleanor said, "and no one else was doing it." It was not an accusation. She had not meant it as one particularly, but she watched it land in him anyway, watched the particular stillness that comes over a proud man when a plain fact arrives without the courtesy of softening. He signed the letter to Hartley without further argument, and the estate's wool income rose that spring by nearly £400, and the county, which noticed such things the way it noticed everything, slowly, and then all at once, began to speak of the young Duchess of Rowan as a woman who understood land the way her husband's steward did, and better than most of his neighbours' stewards managed. Julian began, without announcing it, to seek her out in the East study in the evenings, ostensibly to review some matter of the accounts, and stay past the point the accounts required. He did not speak of what she had overheard him say in the corridor in September. He did not apologise for it, not yet, because he did not yet know that she knew. But something in him had begun, cautiously, the way a man tests ice, to notice her. Mrs. Fenwick, watching this from the doorway one evening with a stack of linens in her arms, said only, to no one in particular, "Well, there's a start," and carried on down the corridor, satisfied. It was Mrs. Fenwick, in the end, who told Eleanor the shape of what had made her husband cold, though she told it sideways, the way she told everything, while the 2 of them sorted morning black out of the linen presses one wet February afternoon. "He was 9 when his mother died," Mrs. Fenwick said, folding a black shawl with the brisk economy of long practice. Lady Anne, lost in childbed, and the babe with her, a sister he'd have had, if things had gone otherwise. Old Duke Edmund never spoke her name again that I heard, not once in 30 years. Told the boy, not long after, that a house needs a mistress the way a ship needs a keel, and a keel oughtn't confuse itself for the sail. Meaning, keep the household steady, and don't go hoping for wind. She set the shawl down. He was a good father to the boy in every way but that one. Taught him land, taught him figures, taught him duty backward and forward. Never once taught him it was safe to want anything. Eleanor folded a black glove into its pair. Slowly. And the rest of it? Before me? Miss Sophia Kellerman, Mrs., Fenwick said, with the flat disapproval of a woman recounting an old scandal she had never forgiven. Engaged to his Grace, Lord Ashworth, he was then 6 years back, before his father's title came to him. Jilted him 3 weeks before the wedding for a viscount with a better income. Whole county watched it happen. He never said a word about it after, not one, which I always took to mean it went in deeper than the talking kind of hurt does. She shook out another shawl. So when your marriage came along, arranged sensible like by his father and yours, I expect he thought himself lucky. A wife who wouldn't ask more of him than the house required. Safer that way, in his reckoning. He built himself a keel, and called it a marriage, and never once thought to ask what a keel might want, going forward. Eleanor said nothing for a long moment. She thought of the corridor in September, of suitable, I am not obliged to love her for it, and found that the sentence, turned over in this new light, looked less like contempt and more like a wall a frightened boy had built at 9 years old, and never once been taught to take down. It did not excuse him. She was careful, turning it over, not to let it excuse him. But it explained him, and the two things, she was learning, were not the same country at all. She said as much to Mrs. Fenwick, who only grunted and reached for the next shawl, uninterested in philosophy when there was mending yet to be done. The county, meanwhile, had begun its own slow recalibration, the kind that moves through drawing-rooms and church pews the way tide moves under a dock. Invisible until the boats start to shift. Lady Vane's presence at the September assembly had not gone unremarked, and in the months since, as the wool contract and the drainage ditch and a dozen smaller competencies attached themselves publicly to the Duchess's name, the whisper had begun to change its shape. It was no longer poor Lady Rowan, so plain a match for a man like that. It had become, by February, something closer to, has anyone noticed how much of that estate is actually run by her? Lady Cassandra Vane noticed it before anyone said it aloud, because noticing things before they were said aloud was the whole of her trade. She had spent 2 years cultivating Julian's grief-shadowed attention with a patience Eleanor's competence now threatened to render pointless, and she did not intend to lose ground to a woman who redrew drainage plans in borrowed boots. That same February, quietly over cards at a neighbour's house, she began speaking, gently, regretfully, always as though she wished it were not true, of how very much time the Duchess spent alone with her husband's land steward. Long afternoons, unchaperoned walks along the river bottom, such devotion to the tenants, Lady Vane said, smiling into her hand of cards, that one almost wondered where the devotion truly lay. It was a small stone dropped into still water. But Cassandra Vane, like her cousin-in-arms Reginald Price with his compounding £15,000, understood that a story needed only to be dropped once to begin, on its own, to ripple. The knock came on a Thursday, near midnight, when Eleanor had thought the house long asleep. She was in the east study, as she so often was, a branch of candles burned down to stubs, and the wool ledgers spread before her, when Julian opened the door without ceremony, and stood in it for a moment before he spoke. "You're still working," he said. "I generally am, at this hour." She did not look up. "Is something wrong?" "No," A paused. He came in anyway, and stood by the cold hearth with his hands behind his back, the posture of a man rehearsing a sentence he had not yet found the courage to say plainly. I heard something today. From Fenwick, though she didn't mean to tell me, Reed's wife let it slip to her, and she let it slip to me. About the September assembly. Another pause, longer, about what I said. In the study. Before the ball. You heard it, he said. It was not quite a question. I heard all of it, Eleanor said. Suitable. Keeps the house as it should be kept. Not obliged to love her for it. I believe I have it correctly. He did not flinch, though something behind his eyes moved, the way still water moves when a stone finally reaches the bottom. I've thought about that sentence a great many times since September, he said. I find I cannot make it sound better than it was, however I turn it. I am sorry for it. Not the sentiment behind it entirely. I don't yet know how much of that was true, and how much was cowardice dressed as honesty, but for saying it where you might hear it, and for the year before that, in which I never troubled to learn whether it was true at all. That is an apology, Eleanor said. It is not yet an explanation. I find I want both, before I decide what to do with either. Then I will give you both, Julian said, though not tonight. Not with a speech I've prepared, standing in a doorway. I'd rather show you over time than tell you once and consider the debt paid. Something in Eleanor eased, cautiously, the way a hand unclenches after being closed too long. Show me then, she said. Not tonight, and not with words alone. Show me over time, and I will tell you plainly if I believe it. That's fair, Julian said. It is, Eleanor agreed, and for the first time in 3 years, something like a treaty passed between them, unwitnessed, in a cold room at midnight, sealed with nothing more than 2 people agreeing to be honest about the shape of what came next. She reached up, without entirely deciding to, and touched the small brass key at her throat, the one Edmund had pressed into her palm on his deathbed, a year before, with words she had never fully understood. For when you need it, not before. She had worn it since as a private thing, hidden beneath her collar, meaningless to anyone who did not know its origin. That night, for the first time, she let it show above the fabric, in plain sight, and did not know yet how soon she would need it. She needed it 11 days later, when Mr. Josiah Pruitt, the family's solicitor, wrote to say that Reginald Price had formally lodged his claim, £15,000, now compounded to something nearer 27, secured, he asserted, against Hartwell Grange, with a note in the late Duke's own hand as proof, and a demand that the matter be settled before Lady Day or the Grange be surrendered in payment. Eleanor read the letter twice, and thought of the small brass key, and understood, finally, what it had been waiting for. Edmund's private muniment room sat behind a locked door at the end of the north gallery, a room Julian had not entered since his father's funeral, and Eleanor had never entered at all. The key from her throat turned in its lock, as though it had been cut for that purpose, and no other, which, she understood now, it had. Inside, among boxes of old correspondence and estate maps gone soft with damp, she found a deed box marked with Edmund's initials, and a date 8 months before his death, and inside it, beneath a stack of ordinary papers, a sealed letter addressed, in Edmund's own hand, to her. She sat on the floor of the muniment room in the grey afternoon light, and read it twice before she believed it. He had watched her, the letter said, for 2 years before he wrote it, watched her keep the house his own wife had once kept, watched her balance books his son would not open, watched her walk the land in borrowed boots when no one asked her to. He had come, slowly and against 30 years of his own doctrine, to believe that the keel he had once told his son to prize above the sail was, in her case, the very thing steering the ship. He had drawn up a codicil, witnessed and sealed by Pruitt, leaving her, not Julian, not the entail, but her, by name, Eleanor Ashworth, Hartwell Grange and £40,000 in the funds, to be delivered upon Pruitt's judgment that she had proven herself the steward he believed her to be. "I was wrong about your mother," the letter said, in a hand grown shaky near the end. "I was wrong to teach my son that love and duty could not share a house. Do not let him make my mistake twice, and do not let Reginald take from you what I have finally had the sense to give." Beneath the letter, in the same box, Edmund's own travel diary from 1808, the year of Reginald's supposed debt, placing the old Duke in Bath for the entire month the forged note claimed a meeting in London, an alibi written 8 years before anyone thought to need it. Eleanor sat a long while with the letter in her lap, and did not weep, though she allowed herself, for once, to waive the 4-minute ration entirely, and simply breathe. Cassandra Vane's counterpunch arrived 3 days later, in the form of 2 letters delivered anonymously to half the drawing-rooms in the county, purporting to be correspondence between the Duchess and her land steward, warm in a manner no working correspondence ought to be. Eleanor read the copy Mrs. Fenwick brought her with the same flat attention she gave a miscounted ledger. "They've spelled Reed's Christian name wrong," she said. "He signs himself Absalom. Whoever wrote this used Absalom, with an O. Reed's own father misnames him that way sometimes, out of an old family joke. No stranger would know to make that particular error, unless they'd heard it second-hand and repeated it carelessly." She set the letters down. "It's a forgery, and not a careful one. I imagine we'll be able to prove it in an afternoon." She was not angry. She was, if anything, faintly, coldly amused, the way a woman is amused by an opponent who has finally shown her the whole of their hand. The hearing was called for the 2nd week of March, at the County Assize Rooms in the Town Hall, ostensibly to settle Reginald Price's claim against Hartwell Grange before the magistrate, though by the morning it convened, half the county had found some pretext to attend, drawn by the scent of scandal the way birds are drawn to a turning field. Eleanor arrived with Mr. Pruitt on one side, and a leather case of ledgers on the other, and she did not look for Julian in the crowd, though she felt him there, near the front, watching her with an attention he no longer troubled to hide. Reginald Price presented his note first, brisk and confident, £27,000 named aloud to a room that murmured at the sum. Cassandra Vane sat near him, composed, her letters folded in her reticule for later, should the note alone not suffice to end matters in his favour. "I should like to ask Mr. Price a question," Eleanor said, when Pruitt yielded her the floor, and her voice did not rise, though the room went very quiet to hear it. "You state the note was signed in London, the 14th of October 1808, I do," Reginald said. "The late Duke's own travel diary, which I discovered a week past among his private papers, and which Mr. Pruitt has examined and attests is genuine, places him in Bath from the 1st of October to the 9th of November that year, in company with his physician, for a complaint of the lungs." She set the diary on the table before the magistrate. "I invite anyone in this room who was in Bath that autumn to confirm it. I believe several were." An elderly woman 3 rows back rose unbidden. "I was," she said. "Took the waters myself that October. Saw the old Duke there most mornings, coughing something terrible. I'd swear it before God or a magistrate, whichever's asking." Reginald's composure did not break so much as it simply stopped being composure. The particular stillness of a man watching arithmetic he has falsified failed to hold under a stranger's honest memory. Absalom Reed testified next, plainly, in his own broad voice, that he had never in 20 years' service written a warm word to the Duchess, nor received one, and that the letters bearing his name misspelled it in a manner no one but his own father had ever used, a fact the postmaster, called to examine the ink and paper, confirmed matched none of the stock sold within 30 miles, but did match a lot sold, that winter, at a shop in the town where Lady Vane was known to keep an account. Cassandra Vane did not rise to defend herself. She sat very still, her gloved hands folded in her lap, and something behind her practised composure went out like a snuffed candle, quiet and complete. "I could ask that both matters be referred for full prosecution," Eleanor said, when the magistrate turned to her for a final word, and the room held its breath to hear whether she would. "I have the documents to see it done, but I find I would rather see this county's business settled than see 2 people ruined for the sake of watching them fall. Mr. Price may repay what legal costs this hearing has occasioned, and relinquish his claim entirely, and Lady Vane may leave the county within the month, and I will pursue neither of them further." She looked at them both, evenly, that is mercy, not weakness. "I would ask that no one here mistake the two." The room did not applaud, it was not that sort of room, but the murmur that moved through it afterward was the sound of a verdict already returned before the magistrate spoke his own. Julian, at the front, watched his wife the way a man watches something he has only just understood he might lose, and had never once feared losing until this precise moment. He found her that evening in the east study, ledgers put away for once, the fire built up against the March cold, and he did not stand in the doorway rehearsing a sentence this time. He sat across from her and began. "An apology tells you I am sorry," he said. "An explanation tells you why it happened, so you can judge whether it will happen again. I owe you both, and I've put off the second one long enough." He told her then, in full, his mother's death, the sister he'd never known, his father's doctrine of keel and sail delivered to a 9-year-old boy who had no defences against it, Sophia Kellerman's public jilting 6 years past, and the wall he had built afterward, brick by careful brick, and mortared shut with the word suitable the day he married a woman he had decided, for his own safety, never fully to see. I told myself it was honesty, keeping you at that distance. It was cowardice. I have known that since September, and lacked the courage to say it until March. Eleanor listened without interrupting, which was its own kind of mercy, and when he finished she said, "Thank you for the explanation. Now here are my terms, and I would rather state them once, plainly, than have us circle them for a year." "Say them," Julian said. "Hartwell Grange and its income are mine, by your father's own hand, and I intend to keep them mine, held separately, managed by me. The estate books remain in my keeping, not as a courtesy you extend, but as a fact you accept. You will not speak of me again, to anyone, in the language of what I am useful for, and every labourer on this land will be paid a wage I consider fair, posted publicly, not merely offered privately, when it's convenient to remember them." She paused. "That is the whole of it." "All right," Julian said. "All right, then," Eleanor said. "And that will be the whole treaty. The wages went up that same week, 9 shillings to 12 for the day labourers, posted on the estate office door where any tenant could read the figure for himself, and Reed read it twice before he nodded once, satisfied, the way a man nods at a fair season's accounting. What came after was not a single scene, but 100 small ones, and Eleanor found, watching them accumulate through that spring, that this was precisely how the style of change he owed her would have to be paid, not in one grand gesture, which cost a man nothing but performance, but in ordinary days repeated, until they built into something a single fine morning could never counterfeit. He began taking his coffee in the east study rather than the breakfast room, not to watch her work, but simply to be near it, and after a fortnight he began asking questions about the ledgers, instead of merely admiring that they existed. He moved a second chair beside hers at the estate desk, without comment, and it stayed there. When Reed came with a query about the spring planting, Julian directed him to Eleanor first, publicly, in front of 2 other tenants, a small, unremarkable sentence, "Ask my wife." "She'll have the figures," that meant, to anyone who had watched this county's slow recalibration. Everything, none of it, alone would have amounted to much. Eleanor understood that, and said as much to Mrs. Fenwick one evening, turning a shirt collar in the lamplight. "Nothing in isolation," she said, "everything in accumulation." "That's marriage for you, Mrs., Fenwick said, without looking up from her own mending, same as it's mending. One stitch tells you nothing. Look at the whole seam after a month, though. The relapse came in April, small and almost forgivable, which was precisely why it mattered. A tenant cottage on the north boundary needed a new roof before the spring rains, and Julian, out riding the land alone one morning, authorised the repair on the spot, out of old habit, without a thought toward the wife, whose ledgers would have to account for it, and whose judgment he had promised, weeks before, to consult as a partner rather than inform as an afterthought. He told her himself that evening, before she could hear it from Reed. "I did it without you," he said. "I didn't think of it until I was riding home. It wasn't defiance. It was simply the old way, coming back without my noticing." "I know," Eleanor said. "I could hear it happening, if that makes sense, the pattern, not the roof. You've spent 30 years deciding things alone and telling people after. That doesn't unlearn itself in a season." "No," Julian agreed. "But I'd like it to unlearn itself faster than a season, if you'll be patient with the process." "I'm not asking for perfection," Eleanor said. "I'm asking you to notice, the way you noticed tonight, before I have to point it out to you. You managed that much on your own. That's the whole test, really, not whether the old habit comes back, but whether you catch it before it costs anyone anything." He was quiet a moment, turning that over. "I would choose you," he said finally, "if I were choosing today, knowing everything I know now, the ditch and the wool contract and the hearing and all of it. I have been choosing you, in fact, for some months now, in every small way I knew how, and I find I'd like to say it plainly for once, instead of trusting you to notice on your own." He paused. "I would choose you. I have been choosing you for some time." It was not the bare 3 words the county's other courtships were built on. It was better, Eleanor thought, for being earned, and for costing him something to say. And she told him so, quietly, and let that be the whole of her answer that night. 2 years passed the way seasons do at Rowan Hall, each one accounted for. Each one a little warmer than the one before. Lady Cassandra Vane left the county within the month, as agreed, and settled eventually in a smaller way in the north, where, Mrs. Fenwick reported with grim satisfaction, she was said to keep her own household accounts now, having learned rather late what it cost to be careless with other people's paper. Reginald Price repaid what the hearing had cost him, relinquished every claim on Hartwell Grange in writing, and took a modest position managing a cousin's land in Dorset, where he was, by all reports, scrupulously honest about every figure that crossed his desk. Having learned the price of the alternative in a crowded assize room he never quite stopped thinking about. Absalom Reed was made head steward of the whole Rowan estate that same year, a position he filled with the same flat competence he had always brought to the drainage of a single meadow, and it was his name, at Eleanor's insistence, that appeared beside hers on the wage board posted outside the estate office, a board that had by then become a fixture of the county, copied, grudgingly, by 2 neighbouring estates, who found their own labourers asking pointed questions about. The difference: Hartwell Grange, under Eleanor's separate management, funded in its second year a small school for the tenant children of both estates, the sort of institution old Duke Edmund had never thought to build, and would, Eleanor privately believed, have approved of entirely, given how thoroughly his own final letter had confessed the cost of an education that taught duty and never once taught worth. The small brass key no longer hung hidden beneath Eleanor's collar. It hung now on a hook by the front door of Rowan Hall, in plain sight, where any hand in the household might reach it, and it opened, these days, nothing more guarded than the toy cupboard in the nursery, where a boy not yet 2 years old kept a wooden fleet of ships his father had carved him one long winter, keel and sail both, given equal weight at last. The house itself, callers remarked, seemed different these last 2 years, though none of them could quite say how, only that it no longer held the particular held-breath quality it once had, the sense of rooms arranged rather than lived in. It breathed now, the way a house breathes when the people inside it have stopped performing its rooms for each other and simply occupy them. Eleanor Ashworth had stopped asking, long before any of this, to be seen. She had made herself, instead, impossible to unsee, not through beauty, which fades, and not through pleading, which persuades no one worth persuading, but through ledgers that balanced and land that drained, and wages posted where every hand that earned them could read the figure for themselves. She had not waited to be valued. She had made herself, one dug ditch and one honest number at a time, too valuable to overlook, and she had learned in the process the one distinction the whole county eventually learned alongside her, that being needed is not the same as being loved, that an apology is not the same as an explanation, and that a man's arithmetic, however coldly delivered, can always be corrected, not because he is forgiven for it, but because she was never for one single day of it wrong about her own worth. That was not a thing that could be taken from her. It had never, in the end, been his to take.